Hello everyone, my name is Mike Mareshi, and I'm going to give a brief presentation on the screw. The screw is a very simple device, but it's one I think we take for granted. For thousands of years the screw has made things easier, and there are numerous creations that would not be possible without it. So I'd like to show you some examples of those creations while discussing the history of the screw and the impact it has had on society. First, quick overview of what a screw is. Most people will recognize it, but a screw is a cylinder with helical grooves along its surface, which we refer to as threads, and it translates a rotational force into a linear force. So if you think about the screw as a fastener, you turn the head of the screw clockwise, and the screw will move forward so you can join two materials together. It's a common use of the screw, and probably what most people think about when they hear it, but it's not how the screw first started out. The screw actually originates in ancient Greece. However, historians are split on who actually invented it. Some believe it was Hylas in the 4th century BCE, while others think it was Archimedes sometime in the 3rd century BCE. I think Archimedes is probably the favorite since the water screw, which is one of the first uses of the screw, actually bears his name. Archimedes' screw appears around 235 BCE, and it was basically a primitive water pump. The screw spiral was placed inside a tube and was operated by a hand crank at the top of the tube, which would lift the water up from the bottom. So it was great for removing water from the bottom of ships and for irrigation. Water could be siphoned out of the river and into irrigation trenches without having to constantly go back and forth to the riverbank with buckets. It was a very beneficial device, and it was used for hundreds of years throughout the Mediterranean region. In fact, we actually still use the water screw today in wastewater treatment. Another early use of the screw was for the screw press, which was in the 1st century BCE. It was a fruit press that was used for extracting oil and juice for making wine and olive oil, and things like that. Earlier presses that didn't use a screw were not very efficient, and they required so much force to operate them that they typically had to be animal driven. So using a screw for pressing was great because it reduced friction, which not only extracted more juice, but it made it easy to operate. So humans could actually operate the press themselves by hand with a lever. So even though with all these benefits of the screw, it doesn't appear too much in the ancient world. It's most likely because screws were made of wood and had to be meticulously carved by hand. But wooden screws do still appear again. In fact, centuries later, the printing press would actually use a very similar design of the original fruit press. Metal screws appeared in the 15th century, and they actually started in the form of augers and drills. So even though screws still weren't being used as a fastener, they did help in construction. Before this time, nails and ropes were used to hold things together, as well as pins. But using pins was difficult because the only tools they had for making holes were awls and chisels. Once the hand drill came about, it was much faster and easier. Bigger pins could be used, thicker materials could be drilled out easier, and it was a much stronger joint than tying them together. Screws started to be used as fasteners in the 16th century, but even when they came about, they still weren't widely used because they were difficult to make, since they had to be tediously filed by hand. Making internal threads for nuts was even more difficult. So nails and pins remained the preferred method for a while because they were still cheaper and easier to produce. That finally all changed at the end of the 18th century when Henry Moseley invented the screw cutting lathe. This allowed for screws to be mass-produced with precision threads. And it's a little hard to see here, but one of the primary components of the lathe, which is right here under the highlight, is actually a long screw. We'll talk about ironic. A screw is required to make more screws. We still rely heavily on the screw today for many different things. We have screw top storage containers and bottles that help to preserve our food. The mining and drilling industry use augers and drills to acquire our important resources. The construction and manufacturing industries use all kinds of screw devices and fasteners. Just imagine how difficult life would be without this little device. Looking at one particular area, let's look at cars. Cars use hundreds of screws, nuts, bolts, threaded linkages So could we even build cars without the screw? And if we could, imagine how expensive and time consuming it would be to build and maintain them. How would you do simple things like changing your tires or your oil? Life would be very difficult and very different without this little device. And these are just a few examples of how important it is to us. Now, in some cases, there are alternatives to the screw. Today, many modern glues and adhesives are trying to take the place of fasteners. But the screw itself is a very important device and one that we are always going to need. Thank you.